Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sarah Groh, and I'm the Advocacy Director of the America Forward Coalition, a coalition made up of 75 education and workforce development nonprofits working in communities across the country. I'm so grateful to be here with you all today for a really timely and relevant conversation about trauma-informed education policy and practice, and incredibly grateful to be joined by 3 field leaders who are deeply invested in this work. I would love to introduce you to my 3 panelists this morning. Iddrissu is the Managing Director of External Affairs for Educators for Excellence. Gisele Shorter is the Vice President of Policy and Partnerships at Turnaround for Children. And Rahn Dorsey is the Chief Education Officer in the City of Boston. And a warm welcome and a thank you to everyone here in the audience in Austin, as well as those watching online and participating from afar. To open up our conversation today, I'd like to give each of our panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves, to say a little bit about what brings them to this work and what brings them to this conversation today. Gisele?
Hi, so I am a born and raised New Yorker, born in El Barrio, Spanish Harlem. And I'm clear, that's right, I'm clear that the access and opportunity that I had to attend world-class schools that really invested in me finding my voice, cultivating aspects of my personality, my skill development, what were innate skills versus skills that I needed to really strengthen, and the mindsets and orientation that I received are not, they're not uniform, right? There are members of my family that didn't have the same access, and it informed what was the arc of our lives. And so I am committed to providing access and opportunities and creating an ecosystem that really incentivizes and supports all young people to be who they want to be.
Good afternoon, everybody. With more enthusiasm, good afternoon, everybody. All right, it's good to be with you. My name is Rahn Dorsey. I'm the Chief of Education for the City of Boston. But I'm a native Detroiter, and Detroit was Wakanda before Wakanda. But having grown up in that city, I grew up in a public school system that created very unique school communities and very supportive school communities at a number of levels. So I knew from the experience of a young person what that felt like. I also grew up raised by educators. I went to the school that my mom taught at. When I was in elementary school, I was raised by her friends and saw them inside and outside of school. So I knew the kind of dedication and the thought and how much of themselves they put into the work that they did. In my professional life, I've spanned school and out of school work and really, I think, have begun to think a lot about how we harness the ecosystem of learning and support opportunities. And I'll talk a lot more about some of the intersectional work that I think we need to do, but there is a way for us to think more broadly about how to make sure young people have all of the resources that they need and that we put them in positions to be self-determining. So it's good to be here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah, and many things bring me to this work and specifically to this conversation. The first one is I'm a former educator, and so I've spent time in the classroom specifically with children who were deemed emotionally disturbed, students with special education labels, and their stories really, as well as my own personal story as the daughter of a woman who was a refugee to this country and was doing her best to find the best education and didn't know that trauma was part of the equation and how to get a better education and those supports. So I entered the classroom and immediately saw so much trauma that wasn't being treated, that wasn't being supported, and that was being ignored. And I'm seeing nods from educators in the room that know that this conversation has been in the classrooms and in the lunchrooms for far too long. And so I'm excited today to bring it to literally the light so that we can have a conversation that moves us forward.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Sarah, Rahn, and Gisele, I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to be in conversation with you today. Speaking from my own experience, I know that what brings the 4 of us to this stage is a deep commitment to our students. And in terms of my entry into this conversation, when I was doing case management support at an early childhood program in Boston, we worked primarily with families that were referred from the emergency shelter system. The experiences of trauma and chronic homelessness impacted their ability to access education, their ability to access supports, And then I think in my personal lived experience as someone who during my time in college experienced sexual assault, I think I'm acutely aware that from the earliest ages up through K-12 in our higher education system, trauma and adversity impacts students' ability to learn, to engage, and to thrive. And so we are grateful to hold this space today, grateful to have this conversation, and we really want to welcome you all in. We view you as partners. Some of you in this audience may be in the classroom. You may be taking on this work on an interpersonal level every day. Some of you are leading researchers and academics. And some of you, while this may be your first conversation explicitly about trauma-informed education, we believe that there's no shortage of work to do. And so we welcome you in, and we are grateful for your partnership. In that aim, we're going to be using a technology platform today called Slido. And this platform you may have seen throughout South by Southwest. This provides us an opportunity to, in real time, have some dialogue with folks on the stage. And we're going to start off with a question. We'd like to get a sense of who's in the room. And so we're going to ask you today, are you new to the conversation about trauma-informed? Have you heard the term before or read an article about it? Or are you someone who is actively working as an advocate or researcher, a leader in your classroom or your community on these issues? So we'll give folks a minute to respond to that. And there's some directions up on the screen, so you have an opportunity to log into that system if you haven't used it before. Support. So it looks like a number of folks are actively working on these issues in their communities, in their districts, and in their classrooms. Additionally, we have some folks who may have read some articles or been introduced to the concept, and then a couple people that are new to the conversation. So a warm welcome to all of you. With that, I would like to share a baseline definition that we can use today to kick off our conversation. So what is trauma-informed education? So on the screen, you'll see a definition that we use as a starting point when we are talking about this work. So we know that trauma and stress can be caused by a variety of sources, as I mentioned. For some students, that may be acute trauma. For others, it may be issues like exposure to domestic violence, chronic housing instability, bullying. And in a trauma-informed school, we dream together of a context where all of the adults are well-equipped, resourced, and supported to meet the needs of students who are experiencing trauma. We know that sometimes, again, trauma is acute and it may impact one student. We also know that at times, whole communities are exposed to trauma. So with that, I'd love to turn to my panelists to add on to this baseline definition. What's missing here? What would you build on? Gisele?
So when I think of trauma-informed, I think there's a deep science and an appreciation for what we know to be the neuroscience, the impact of trauma and toxic stress on learning and development that often isn't infused in the educational experience or the care in which we are designing schools, right? So I think as we go through the conversation, I'll share more of what I believe could be the structural dynamics and underpinnings of how we respond to young people that are experiencing toxic stress, trauma, adversity, and what we should be doing in our ecosystem to solve for it.
Thank you. Ron?
So I'm not sure that trauma-informed is very active. So I at least want to be trauma-responsive. Knowing and doing are often two different things. So the work that we're here to do is to do. So let's make sure that we keep that in perspective. I think what I would also underscore is it's about addressing personal adversity. And there are pieces in here that are absolutely right about creating the community context for building resiliency. And I want us to keep in mind that this is about the work that we do inside of schools and outside of school buildings and do in a strategic and coordinated manner. The last thing I think is about making sure we're clear about the goal. We aren't creating systems and practices and programs for the sake of doing so. What we're really trying to do is better position young people for greater strength and health. And so we've got to make sure that we keep that in front of us as the ultimate goal.
Absolutely.
Trauma-informed. One of the many things that happens when we talk about trauma-informed schools is the onus becomes at the school level and on educators. And we forget that the power lies within legislators to ensure that schools are well-equipped, well-resourced, and have what they need in order for educators to deliver. And so part of the framework that I add is that our legislators need to be trauma-informed They need to know what students are experiencing, what teachers are experiencing, what it means when they pass legislation, and that legislation needs to be designed by folks who are on the ground with the lived experiences of the communities that they are working with. And the second piece is we can't talk about trauma-informed without talking about biases. And so trauma-informed practices imply that we are actively working on the biases that make us forget or overlook the experiences of those whom we are working with.
Absolutely. And Sarah, you touched so well on a point that we wanted to make as we dig in together today. We know that any student can experience trauma and adversity. Any educator can experience trauma and adversity, any member of our community. We also want to acknowledge at the top of this conversation that there are systems and structures in place that sometimes perpetuate the context that our students are living in and predispose folks to chronic trauma exposure. Anything you all want to add on this point around trauma and the opportunity gap and the disparities that we know are inherent?
I think it's important to recognize that how trauma shows up, the what of what young people bring into the classroom and how it presents is often masked as a learning or behavioral challenge, right? So when we look at ED, right, to Sarah, your experience, the ED classification, the inability to connect with others, an inability to focus, the type of cognitive bandwidth and executive functioning that's required for young people to meaningfully engage in the educational experience often is a manifestation of significant trauma and exposure to stress, adversity, right? And so there are biological mechanisms that are creating that context, and yet school systems are designed to identify that there is a misfire, but not the root causes or address those root causes. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that, but I think it's worth noting at the top end that it's a significant driver of disproportionality across all races, but particularly for young people of color.
So Gisele just hit the word for me, disproportionality. I think across a number of systems, we are creating a disproportionate amount of trauma for certain people in our communities and across communities. And so I think we have to kind of take into account, one, the fact that systems are often designed to create some of the adversity that people are experiencing, young people and their families. And part of the work that we have to do is to unravel that bias and address it more deeply, but also position systems to be, again, more responsive to the manifestations that we see.
And we've touched base on the systems that need to be at work for this to happen. The other piece is mindsets. This conversation is about changing the way we interact with students who are coping with trauma, to go from asking them, what's wrong with you? I've heard many educators saying that, like, why are you doing that? What's wrong with you? To what happened to you? What are you feeling? What's going on? And that mindset has to be what changes when we know policy works. Without that, we're not going to be trauma informed.
Absolutely. And with that, Gisele, I'd love to give you an opportunity to speak a little bit about some of the work that you're leading at Turnaround for Children. You're actively working in a number of schools across the country, and additionally, there's a pretty robust commitment to research and advancing what we know about development and learning in neuroscience. Could you speak to that?
Sure. And so I have some slides that we'll use as well. You know, and Turnaround's 15 plus years of serving in schools that were some of the most physically and emotionally unsafe, but also some of the lowest performing schools, right? There was a reoccurring and predictable trend that we saw, right? Physical experience of stress locks young people in the fight, flight, or freeze dynamic. And that toxic stress creates the kind of negative culture that makes it difficult for all young people to thrive, right? When we talk about time, we talk about time on task, we talk about pacing. It's very difficult to navigate when you have young people with unmet needs, significant needs, right? That have manifestations with physical or emotional outbursts. Teachers are not yet prepared to deal with the variety or the volume often of what they're experiencing, what our young people are experiencing. And so I think there's this dynamic that we started to see, and in seeing that it's such a reoccurring and predictable trend, there are solutions that we can actually draw on, right? So there is a group that's been coalescing around the science of learning and development. And there's a emerging story that's coming together that pulls from both the learning science, human development, that tells a story of what we as practitioners, what we as policymakers, policy informers, direct service youth development professionals should hold as core principles, and I'll touch on those explicitly. But it opens the door for new and creative approaches to how we imagine public education and learning as a base map, right? When we hold the constant that learning is inherently social and it is inherently emotional, we start to shift some of the dynamic of how we interact with young people, how we design the experience, and what we expect from young people in that experience. So Turnaround's earliest work was in the area of environments, right? Really, how do you stabilize the environment, recognizing that our origin story was working with schools that were physically and emotionally unsafe, right? How do we stabilize the environment, give back the time to teachers so that they could really focus on the core business of teaching and learning? And what we realized was that while we could support schools to create the calm, orderly, predictable environment, there were a set of adult-level skills and mindsets as well as student-level skills and mindsets that were a prerequisite, right? So if you could calm down the environment, but there weren't the right set of mindsets and orientation to the learning and design of schooling, young people still wouldn't flourish, right? And so we expanded our model and increasingly are clear that it is not just the young people that are experiencing toxic stress and trauma that we have to attune to. It is each and every young person, right? And how do we design systems that account for the environment, right? The deep relationships, the attunement that's required to optimize all young people, but support the cultivation of adult-level skills and mindsets, explicit training of students in the types of skills and mindsets and attributes that we know foster deep learning, a meaningful engagement in the learning experience, and then pair that with solid pedagogy, right? The academic efficacy that's required. And if we could do that, and we call it ESM&A, we can accelerate healthy development, whole child healthy development, and academic attunement. So again, this is rooted in having served in over 100 schools in New York, New Jersey, in Newark, in Washington, D.C., and operating at multiple levels, right? So the whole school transformation that ESSA would require, right, to get at the root of disproportionality, but also to start to engage in system-level consultancies, right? What's the hedge of protection that's required at the district, right, or the SCA level? When Sarah talks about influencing policymakers, what's the funding formula that's required to usher in a new way of being and designing schools? And so that's been our arc to date. So the last piece here, when we started to think about the skills and the mindsets that were required for not only the adults, right, understanding that adults are mediators and moderators of all student level gains, we engaged in a deep literature review. And so that literature review really leveraged 3 guiding principles for inclusion in our building blocks for learning. And I'm going to read those to you. The first was an alignment to the development of the child or children as learners in an educational setting, right? And that's an important distinction because when we think of the out-of-school time or the positive youth development principles that are core, that are generative, there is still a very different function of that time and how it translates than the core academic experience in school, right? And so we don't want to divorce it, but we have to really think about that educational setting. The second is a measurable and malleable set of behaviors or mindsets, not a personality or a character trait, but really digging into the deep science. And then the third was elements that were strongly supported by a research basis that correlate or even predict academic achievement. right? And so when we paired our deep understanding of the impact of adversity, the neurobiology, with the dynamic, resource-rich environments that we would all aspire to create and afford each and every young person, this building blocks for learning started to emerge as core skills, right? And so the last slide here, sorry, I think we cut a slide. The last slide is really calls out the bottom 3 rows of the building blocks for learning are particularly vulnerable, right? Those skills in the development as the cornerstone are particularly influenced by trauma, adversity, the toxicity, and the neurobiological mechanisms that are triggered when young people are growing up in states of poverty that correlate with adversity. And to be clear, poverty does not mean that all young people are growing up or experiencing adversity, right? So I don't want to be misquoted on that. But the bottom 3 rows, right, particularly self-regulation as a cornerstone for accessing all of the higher order skills, mindsets, and the development are particularly vulnerable. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Gisele. We know that there are so many partners at the community level deeply engaged in this work. And Ron, I'd love to have you speak a little bit about the context in Boston. We know that there's meaningful work going on both inside and outside the walls of our schools, as you said at the top of this presentation. Could you talk a little bit more about some of the partnerships and some of the work in that space?
A couple of things. I'm going to do exactly what she said, but I don't follow orders well. So I am going to tell you a little bit about what's happening in schools and kind of expand out to those partnerships.
Yeah.
Also, a lot of my comments will tend to live at the 30,000-foot level because I kind of live at a systems level and not necessarily or not consistently a classroom and school building level. So take that into account with my remarks. So minimally, I think in Boston, we were trying to solve for 2 things from a systems and school standpoint. The first is making sure that we have more appropriate and productive responses to the challenges that we know students are facing in their lives. The second is making sure that school itself is not a trauma-inducing experience. And so to the second point, I often hear from too many students who tell me this verbatim, that school is not a human experience. And so what they mean by that is that it's everything that they're experiencing from the way that the discipline code is implemented, to the ways that they experience racial and gender discrimination, to peer conflict, the cleanliness of school buildings, and the quality of school lunch. So it's a whole lot of factors that they're talking about, but when they describe it in this way, they're telling us that school can be a place that is psychologically, emotionally, and physically destabilizing, and at its absolute worst, compounds the challenges that they're already experiencing in their lives. And so what we're trying to figure out is how do we take this on and reconcile with the fact that school has had very blunt instruments or blunt sets of instruments to deal with this. First has been the student discipline code, which we kind of use to address the behavioral manifestations of deeper challenges for young people. While it may temporarily correct some behavior things, it's not really designed to get at the underlying trauma or ask the why question that Sarah talked about, or the what's going on question. Secondly, we tend to use clinical intervention oftentimes, and it's appropriate sometimes for very extreme cases, but I would argue to you that there is a lot of subclinical work that needs to be done from a school climate development standpoint, from a community building standpoint, and it's really kind of transdisciplinary work that we need to think about what it looks like. If I could ask you to show the slide with the triangle real quickly. I'm glad that came up. So many of you are probably familiar with this kind of tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 interventions. What we think in Boston is that at least in a subset of schools, we aren't dealing with a triangle, we're dealing with a diamond. And so we think that tier 1 may be this narrow tip that describes what everyone needs, but tier 2 may actually be the bigger space, this subclinical space that takes deeper intervention and greater care to care for a greater number of students than we think who have been affected by trauma in many regards. And then there's the clinical tier. There is probably oftentimes a misuse of clinical staff because as I hear them talk, they're kind of all over the place and addressing the gamut of things, but it's extending their expertise, and oftentimes we aren't putting enough money into clinical care to make sure that the numbers of students that we're referring for clinical care actually get high quality service and support. But our clinicians are not the people who are sitting in front of our students most of the time. So this is, I think, more appropriately about classroom educators, our counselors, and our administrators in buildings to great degree. So in Boston, we're beginning to really focus on how do we create more effective Tier 2 interventions, more than the supports that every student needs, but something at a subclinical level that will be less intense but more consistent than clinical work. And so a few things that we've done in Boston. First of all, we've adopted a citywide definition of college, career, and life readiness that describes many of the skills that Gisele referred to in the building blocks. So we're not only trying to highlight what students need to acquire in terms of academic proficiency, but we're trying to highlight the things that hopefully you're building to become a whole person.
That's right.
Over the course of your journey through schools. Secondly, we've implemented and developed for the first time in Boston Public Schools a social emotional learning and wellness department. And so this is the department of the school system that is really thinking about how are we going to blend learning in some ways that integrate academic instruction and positive youth development to promote, first of all, self-awareness, self-management, the development of positive social relations, and effective decision-making among young people. I would add to this that there is also a component of culturally sustaining practice in here, because there's nothing more traumatizing over time than young people having to navigate racism. So we've got to make sure that the curriculum is appropriately responsive, and that the ways that we are interacting with young people and the cultures that we're building in school are culturally sustaining, not just culturally proficient, culturally aware, but that they're sustaining. Wherever you come from, whomever you are, is recognized, affirmed, and built upon in the school environment. We're also experimenting with new measures with academic partners around student resilience, most particularly the holistic student assessment, which is an instrument developed by the Pear Institute at Harvard that looks at 7 self-reported domains of student resiliency. And so we're starting to use this. Actually, we started using it in summer learning. And now our summer experimentation is starting to migrate back into the school year to think about how we use that data. We're widely expanding Boys of Color group work in the district, recognizing that there's a huge opportunity to work with our young men. We're doing preventative work, as is the case through our partnership with the Sandy Hook Promise. And we became partners with Sandy Hook officially, I think, 2 weeks before the Florida shooting. And so this was really an acknowledgement by the district that some of the work that we have to do is being proactive about recognizing social isolation and disaffection among young people, and how do we get out ahead of that. There's a lot of work going on in Boston that lives under the school to prison pipeline umbrella, and I think what I want to call out about that work is, one, a lot of it is student-led. And so it's students, I think, identifying the multi-systems problem, the multiple systems that are generating trauma in our communities, taking stock of the resources that we have inside and outside of school to counteract that, and doing some problem solving. The fact that it lives in this problem solving frame and it's young people leading a conversation about how we create different trajectories, I think in and of itself is empowering, but I think we're starting to see a different results just by virtue of the way that we're designing the conversation. We're also thinking about, as we develop new school buildings and do school renovations, what do human and sensory spaces need to look like in our schools? We want to program for the sustaining interactions that we want between adults and young people, between adults and adults, and between young people and their peers. Outside of school, we're doing some things that I think are, in a very hopeful way, cross-disciplinary and cross-system. We're actually deploying integrated public safety and public health trauma teams across Boston, most oftentimes to respond to incidents of violence. But these teams wind up pushing into schools. They live in this buffer between institutions oftentimes, and I think we're starting to see some of the payoff from that intersectionality, if only because we're seeing a consistent set of professionals who are not only wrapping around those young people, but the adults in their lives to address some fundamental challenges. lastly, there are a variety of nonprofits who are doing great social emotional learning work. First of all, the youth serving nonprofit field might have gotten to social emotional learning well before school did. I mean, I think we called it positive youth development and put a number of different epithets on it. But the out of school time sector has been talking about this work for the last quarter of a century. They've been doing this work for the last quarter of a century with great results, often counteracting the things that were happening in school so that young people could have a different experience than the one that they did during the school day. One of the leaders or emerging leaders is actually one of our faith-based institutions, Roxbury Presbyterian Church in Boston, which is really putting social emotional support into more of a faith-based context, which I think the ministerial and pastoral approach offers you a fundamentally different set of tools and sets you up for a very different set of interactions. And so this is what we need to learn from and figure out what's the application and adaptability to some of our more formal learning settings. I will end by saying that I think all of this work is probably raising as many questions about how to do this work well as it is providing answers to do this work. The first thing that's being called into question are the variety of roles that we're asking of professionals. What are we asking them to do, especially teachers and counselors, in developing and implementing effective trauma response work? And it raises a lot of questions around what professional development needs to look like. We've already thrust a whole lot onto educators, but now we're asking for this kind of transdisciplinary approach to the work that we need to do. We're asking you to be more than you already are, and you are already so much. And so I think we have to try to figure out how do we share the burden of evolving our professions in some ways that make it manageable and certainly make it more effective, but how do we also start to name those other attributes and characteristics that need to be built into the professional profile as well. Boston has wrestled, the last thing I'll say is being called into question is whether schools are the institutions that are best positioned to do this work versus other supporting institutions and systems who have a different kind of expertise to bring to both social emotional learning and trauma response. And so school may not be the locus of intervention, but maybe instead one of several coordinated nodes in the intervention that we need to think about. Boston has been wrestling with various ideas of community schools and figuring out how do you network the set of supports to schools, but we've been having a hard time. I mean, the things that look more formally like community schools have not stuck in Boston for a number of reasons, and I think we're trying to figure out how do we leverage the many community resources that we know we have. We are almost embarrassingly rich in that regard, but I think the management burden that is placed on those networks, the challenge of figuring out the integration in some very authentic ways, and some of just the very practical handoffs of young people and families, and that has proven very difficult for us. And so I think the solutions that we aspire to are intersectional, but we are just on the cusp of really dealing effectively with the intersectional challenges.
Thank you so much, Ron. Sarah, I'd love to pull you in on this. Something Ron mentioned is the role of educators in this work. And this is a place where you've been leading some really robust educator-centered organizing work, which we feel like is such a critical piece of this. We know that teachers are at the front line often of trauma-informed education practice, and that their insights are critical to policy solutions that we craft together. So can you walk us through your process a little bit?
Absolutely. So one of the privileges I have is I get to make sure that educators are a non-negotiable part of policy making, and making sure that their voices are helping design and drive the way policy is being written. And so we've been organizing educators and asked them, what are the top issues that are of concern to you? And after surveying and interacting with over 160 Boston educators, we resoundingly heard that trauma is this area where they're having so much issues in the classroom, but policy is just not talking about. And so this is a quick graph, and it includes 160 educators. One of the questions we asked them was, how much of a struggle is it to support students with trauma in your classrooms? Is it causing disturbance in learning? And 91% strongly agreed that trauma, in fact, is causing disturbance to learning. And I know for educators in the room, that's not news, But when we started having this conversation, actually, it wasn't something that people saw as a policy thing.
Yeah.
This is a thing for educators to just have better relationships with students. It was at the micro level. But as Gisele laid out, this is a clinical issue. And it is impacting the way the brain is working. And so we need to make sure that we're attacking it, not just with school level changes, but also with what Ron was describing, these transformative structural changes at the systems level. And so once our educators voiced how important this issue is to them, I started meeting with policymakers such as Ron, and we started having conversations. And next slide. We started getting a team of educators to drive a set of policy recommendations. When we started talking about policy with educators, the first thing they said was like, what is policy? What does it really mean? I'm just an educator in the classroom. I don't know anything about policy. But what we found is that actually educators have a wealth of knowledge about how to do this well and how to do it right. And so they wrote a policy paper with 10 recommendations for the state and district on how to better create trauma-informed practices. And many of those recommendations are things that we just talked about today. But of course, we couldn't advocate on all 10. That's a lot of advocacy. And so what we did was we polled an additional 528 educators on which of the 10 most resonated with them for advocacy. And we also included stakeholders to make sure that they were the most viable. And what we found were two. One educator said that they just did not have enough professional development to actually help support students. So imagine that. You have students coming into the classroom with a lot of trauma, and they're acting out or acting in, and educators do not usually have the proper training to help support those students. So that was simple, but really profound. And so one of the recommendations which educators are advocating for is we need more professional development to help support our students. The second one was they felt as though there aren't enough professional staff to help support our mental health staff, such as guidance counselors and school psychologists in schools. And so they wanted more support staff in schools. And so we thought about if this is really a problem and looked at the recommended ratio of guidance counselors to students, and the recommended ratio is actually one guidance counselor to 250 guidance counselors, students. And what we found was usually schools were looking at one guidance counselor to 1,000 students in our most vulnerable populations of students. And that was, to me, heartbreaking, that we have students who desperately need mental health supports, and their first line of access is school, and they cannot access it. And so they're in classrooms where they're not being supported. And so that's another part of our advocacy. And when we talk to city level officials, we know that state funding structures are not designed to best resource the most vulnerable populations of districts. And so we're also looking at state level advocacy around what equitable school funding structures looks like. And we didn't think we were going to get this wonky and in the weeds of policy. We thought, at first this was going to be a hearts and minds issue, but it actually brings in a lot of issues. And trauma-informed practices implies not just funding and more support staff, but also we have to look at immigration policies and how they impact the school. We have to look at all of these political aspects of what is coming into schools and how are we responding to them. And so now our educators, I'm really proud of them, next slide, are advocating at the city and state level. Recently, we had educators go to the State House and talk about why the school funding reforms impact them. And we had one educator in particular talk about Three Little Pigs and how she was reading a story in her classroom to her kindergartners about the Three Little Pigs. And it was carpet time, and they were talking about the first house getting blown down and it was straws. And the student mentioned that it reminded her of her home in Vietnam and how they had to leave. And then the brick homes came up, and she said, yeah, now we have brick homes in Boston. And she described the climate in which she is experiencing her neighborhood. And so a simple story, Three Little Pigs, that most people think is just going to be a cute little thing in the carpet, ends up becoming this therapy session. And so at the State House, she said, I need a guidance counselor to be able to talk to these students. I can't hear these things and continue a lesson or a reading strategy session when I know that this child needs to talk. And so in that state house, a place of a lot of power and privilege and is often inaccessible to educators, she brought the house down. And it was a powerful moment because it shows that educators need to be in the front lines of creating policy. And I know that we ask educators to do a lot, but I have never heard an educator turn down the opportunity to have their voice heard. And so as we're asking educators to do more, we also need to make sure that they're part of the design and how we're rolling out these things. And so the note on the right-hand side, to my right-hand side, is from a former student of mine. And I often get notes from students, and they're really cute, and I miss them. But this note was particularly heartbreaking, and it was a student just doodling about how they wonder if educators understand how much stress students are in. And I know that educators understand, but the question is also, oftentimes they do, maybe not the depth, is as a society, do we understand the stress that students are under and how much it's impacting the process of teaching and learning, as Gisele laid out? And so part of this policy process is we have to get people at the front lines, our first responders, to be designing and driving policy. Rather than making them the subjects of policy, they have to be the catalysts.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And in turn, we'd like to have a conversation now about some of those explicit policy recommendations that you previewed. In my capacity working as the advocacy director at the America Forward Coalition, I'm really fortunate to work with organizations like Sarah's and Gisele's because we believe that policy is best when it's proximate to the work that's going on in our schools and communities. And so our constant opportunity and challenge is to bring policy conversations closer to folks that are on the front lines of these issues, make those conversations more accessible, and make our policy solutions more responsive to lived experience of our constituents. So there are a couple recommendations on the screen that we wanted to share with folks. Some that Sarah lifted around professional development, around additional resources, around support staff, providing space and capacity for districts to do strategic planning that brings in resources like Gisele previewed at the top of the conversation, allowing coordinated opportunities, as Ron spoke to make the school walls more permeable and talk about the complement of partners that we need at the table to drive forward on robust solutions that are responsive to needs in our community. And additionally, to think about some of the resources that we need to build a really robust research base. What we know now in the field of trauma response, neuroscience, adversity, we're light years ahead of where we were 10 or 20 years ago. And I think folks on this stage would offer that there's still robust work to do in that space. So how can we create more responsive tools that are supporting our educators, our community members, our parents, our students? And how can we also bring students into the core of this work to ensure that their lived experiences, their voices, and their advocacy is driving the conversation forward? So with that, I would love to open it up to the panel to build on the policy recommendations on the screen and to talk a little bit more about what we need policymakers to understand about the context we're operating in for trauma-informed education. And I'll preview that we have a number of great, thoughtful questions coming in on Slido. Feel free to keep sending those. In just a moment, we're going to open up in a Q&A and engage in discussion.
So I believe I have some slides again on the science of learning and development. So to Sarah's point, I mean, there needs to be a dynamic relationship between the research, what science would suggest, but also the deep practice, right? So how do you amplify the expertise of professionals and pair them with researchers, with scientists, but put them in a position where what they're seeing on a day-to-day basis can be harvested and amplified, right? And in that amplifying effect, it translates into new solutions, system level drive toward impact at scale so that more young people can benefit from what we know works, right? There's a concept that's coming out of the science of learning and development, and we call that SOLD, right? There are 4 principles. The first is malleability, right? So the very notion that the brain is malleable and the underpinning, as mammals, we are still developing, that our brain, while it is particularly sensitive to the impact of trauma and stress, right? That there are explicit moves, design level shifts that can encourage and promote the development of new tissue, of hardwired dynamic relationships in the brain, right? And we can geek out on that, but the concept of malleability is transformative, right? And if you walk away with nothing else, there's a talking point that I want you to nail, which is that genes are chemical followers, right? Of the 25,000 genes that were mapped as part of the genome, right? Less than 10% of our genes ever manifest, because genes only manifest in relation to the context in which we experience life, right? So micro and macro ecologies. So when we talk about what shows up in the heart of a school, how young people are experiencing life, how that informs their expression of self, their gene manifestation, right? The extent to which housing stock, access to opportunity, social justice, equity is experienced by a child, right? On the macro constructs of race and poverty, and how we are rolling out our resource allocations, the micro ecologies, right? The deep relationships and the environments in schools, right? That one-to-one interaction. The idea that oxytocin is the antidote to cortisol, which is developed when you are in that fight, flight, or freeze dynamic. And I'm not talking about relationships, the softer side of relationships that many people default to. I'm talking about the deep attunement, the ability to see young people beyond how they show up as their best selves, and sometimes as their not so best selves, right? And to leverage those deep relationships to create a space where young people see the possibilities for their lives, right? And school becomes the platform for developing the set of skills and mindsets that can carry young people throughout their life course, right? So that's the type of environment that we're talking about here, right? And so fundamentally, I'm suggesting that instead of asking young people to beat the odds, to be better than the worst statistic from the communities, whatever community they come from, that we collectively have a set of tools, right? If we start to clue into some of the science and the research, we have solutions, right? There are seeds of greatness that are showing gains and deep impact for young people. That if we start leveraging some of those things, we can use science to change the odds for all young people, so that each and every child can be leveraged, right?
Gisele, it's such an important point, and we know that this is deep interpersonal, relational work. And we know that policy is a blunt instrument. So I think, we feel that it is critical that at the state, local, and federal level, we are thinking about how to resource our educators, how to incentivize partnerships, how to build capacity. And at the same time, I don't aim to say that there are any simple solutions on this stage. And so we're really grateful to continue conversations with partners to bring more folks into the fold. I want to preview a few policy footholds that are out there in the space right now. So in Massachusetts, the Safe and Supportive Schools Act was passed a few years back as part of a comprehensive violence bill that was signed into law by the governor. What that allowed was to seat a commission in the state of Massachusetts to address some of these issues, to leverage the research and the practitioner insight, and additionally to provide some really modest funding to a number of districts to maybe hire a support staff member or hold some space to have some meetings around this. At the federal level right now, we're looking at where we could find some similar footholds. We think a baseline that's really important here is we do not have a consistent definition in federal statute what trauma-informed education practice looks like. There are a few places where we see it listed as a priority or an opportunity to use some flexible federal grant funding, but we think there's much more we can do to drive resource and to drive practice and collaboration. Additionally, in the city of Boston, Sarah, Ron, and I both know a great parent organizing group, C Plan, that has been very active in this space. And so as we think about the stakeholders that need to be crafting the responsive local policy, that's absolutely a piece of this work too. I'd love to invite you both in if there are other thoughts you'd like to share on the policy.
Absolutely. And going back to the message that I keep driving, the designers of policy work, especially when we're talking about transforming the way relationships are happening at the school level through policy, which is a blunt instrument. Those designers and the people whom we engage have to be parents, students, educators, our first responders. Without that, we're going to have another policy that's written and isn't going to change the way we do things. And so when we are trauma-informed, it's really important that we think about student activism and how to get them engaged so that they can be telling us, like, this is what I'm experiencing and this is what I need in the classroom. And how are we doing that both at the city level and at the state level. Federal might be a little bit more difficult, but that is one of my proposals.
So a few things. One, I think we have to recognize a set of preconditions here. So everything that Gisele said about the science, we need to figure out how to translate into high utility information.
That's right.
So our policymakers are expert in a number of levels, but compared to you, they play in the shallows. So we need to take everything here, figure out how we make it more nuanced, deeper than their talking points. And their talking points have nuance to them, but oftentimes if you keep asking questions, it gets no deeper than the talking points. So as you said, we need the folks who are most expert designing the policy. At least in Massachusetts, one of the other preconditions that we have to deal with is that I think legislators are not only fatigued, but are getting paralyzed around decision-making in the education arena. We went through a pretty exhausting charter district conflict in the state of Massachusetts. Our funding formula for schools is one that is so arcane and complex that people are afraid to touch how we think about dealing with resources because they can't anticipate the unintended consequences very well. And so now we're starting to see legislators become very gun-shy about the work that we might do in education. But let me propose to you what I think are maybe 4 policy objectives. They're big buckets of things that we need to take on and not specific recommendations. The first objective is making sure that we've got R&D capital for innovation work in this space. If we're going to do more SEL work, trauma responsive work, there are a lot more things that we need to try, prototype, and iterate on. The problem is that there is no risk capital in education. So we have got to figure out how to infuse risk capital and create the culture of innovation. So educators are not rewarded for being entrepreneurial. There's no time for you to do it. When you step out with a new idea, there are a whole lot of roadblocks. So we need to figure out how to deal with that. Schools and districts actually aren't learning organization, quiet as it's kept. So even when good ideas come to the fore, there aren't very formal organizational development processes to then take that back in and start asking questions about how we transform the organization to support what we think the most powerful practice is. So we've actually got to do some org development work to figure out how to transform those institutions. But without the capital, the risk capital to do things, it's going to be hard for us to create the tools and the approaches that we need. Secondly, and I think it's embedded somewhere on this slide, we need some clarifying and unifying measures for the progress that we're looking for. And that's everything from student progress indicators to professional effectiveness indicators. And the tools that we're using to capture and analyze the data have to have some synchronicity. Getting to comparable analytic frameworks is going to be important to move us from a place where we're debating what the concept of SEL and trauma-informed and trauma responsiveness is and debating the nomenclature with one another to actually getting to a place where we're comparing the relative performance of our approaches, because we've got some apples to apples ways to look at that, but we've got to get to that framework that gives us a common lens on the work. The third thing is that we have to think about institutionalizing and scaling best practice. We're beginning to see some things that are promising, and so we need to build the runway for those things to be able to adopt them and scale them. But I think the caution here is that, especially at a policy standpoint or from a policy perspective, we have to be sure not to issue silver bullet mandates.
That's right.
So to put into policy mandates that say schools and school systems have to do this one thing because we think we found the answer, the only thing that works. When the fact of the matter is that innovation is still going to be needed, and silver bullet mandates will actually undermine innovation in a lot of ways and prevent us from getting to the differentiation of practice that we need and being responsive to the different kinds of students that we have to support. Lastly, we need multi-systems investments. And so this is pretty far outside the scope of most policymaking. Maybe we saw it in P3 in the workforce development arena, but we tend to fund in very siloed ways. We've got to create policy that is explicitly ecosystem focused. And so we have to make sure that it creates incentives for education, pub health, public safety, community development, all to have to be at the table with one another, and thinks about how you resource that in more creative ways. And give them a focus, again, I'll say, on the subclinical work that needs to be done, because if we're trying to get to where the larger aggregation of students are, it's not just about figuring out how do we create more clinicians out of this. It really is figuring out how do we create transdisciplinary professionals, put them in the relationships that are most effective to support practice, and resource and network them in very effective ways.
Thanks so much, Ron. In closing, we have a number of questions that have come in specifically around support and resource for our teachers. A couple questions that touched on how do we also support the impact of trauma that our educators may experience firsthand. And additionally, an educator wrote in and said, what are the procedures and systems that work? I know exactly what it looks like in my classroom when a student is impacted by trauma. I don't often know where to go next. And so I'd invite each of our panelists to respond to some of those prompts around supporting our educators, and also in closing issue a call to action if that's something you'd like to share at this time.
I have a specific response to supporting educators. Trauma can also be something that people take on. And so it's important that we recognize the role that it has with impact to first-line responders. So educators also need trauma-informed practices from their school leaders. And so part of my call to action is understanding, and it goes back to what Ron laid out, that policy is not going to solve everything. It's going to be a blunt instrument. What it can do is create that baseline definition of what trauma is, get everybody on board, elevate the importance of creating trauma-informed practices, but then create investments at the community level, school level, district level to incentivize people to take innovative and responsive solutions to what works for them. So there is a place for policy, but it isn't going to be the end-all be-all.
One, I think we just have to create spaces for educators to be able to call out the things that they're going through, especially in a very politically charged moment, in a moment where we're oftentimes responding to the trauma that we see in Florida, in schools, and other places. We need to create space for educators just to raise their hand and say, this affected me. I've got to now help students get through this, or maybe I don't, because there's also a challenge here where there is a complicated dialogue between, I think, parents and educators in particular about what's fair game to address in the classroom and what's not. But I think we all have to recognize that adults and young people alike are coming into the classroom with that experience. And again, in this highly politicized moment, it's shared experience in some ways. And so I can't help you until I help me a little bit deal with the moment. And so I think we've got to take that on. As a call to action, I would say let's open source the practice. The rhetoric is getting out ahead of the substance, I think. So we talk about it a lot. There's conceptual language for it, but I don't know if we know it when we see it oftentimes, and we just need to see a lot more of the practice just so we can name what do we think is great practice, what's not meeting, hopefully what will become a collective standard, and to get more nuanced about it. What's most effective for whom in the practices that we're developing. And so open sourcing, I think, can also be an acceleration strategy, because as we think about policy, we cannot, young people don't have time for us to operate at the speed of bureaucracy and research. Young people do not have time for us to operate at the speed of bureaucracy and research. And so open sourcing will allow us to do faster adoption, and policy may have to catch up to that. And when it's doing its work well, it institutionalizes those things that community has optimized already. And so let's show each other what it looks like and have a deep conversation about what we think is good and what we want to keep trying.
So I know they're telling us to wrap, but my call to action would be to remember context matters. And so if we're wanting to really push for whole child development, accelerated academic achievement, we have to recognize that multiple systems are coming to bear in the lives of young people, in families, and that of teachers as well. right? And so we need a more global set of solutions. There are many out there, but we actually have to invest in the type of research and design, amplifying, right? Funding, sharing of what works, what doesn't, across the aisle and across systems.
Thank you all so much. Well, in closing, there are a number of resources on the screen. We hope this is the beginning of many longer conversations with all of you in partnership. I'd like to give a round of applause to my incredible panelists, and thank you all for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you.